with that, I will then defer to my colleague, Chairman Holbert.
Thank you very much. Director Carter? Director Carter, before you start, I'm going to brag on, I'm just kidding, I'm not going to brag on you. I just wanted to make you think just for a second, you know I was.
It's back to that talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, but on a serious note, just as Budget Committee Chairman, I would just really like to ask the agency and the commission members, I know there's some not here, I know we've got a lot of new commission members, but please be as open and as transparent and as honest as we possibly can in this process. Both sides, if we say something, let's make sure it's right on both sides. But I just ask that of the commission members and the agency both. Be as open as possible and as honest as we all can, and be sure when each one of us say something that it's as accurate as it possibly can be.
I think you're a really good guy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could take just for a second, before we get into the budget itself, and to tell you, we'd sent out a thing, and especially to Commissioner Swan on the audit committee, that we had 3 audits going right now, one from Fish and Wildlife Service on our federal funds, one that was a single state audit that dealt with our federal funds, and then our performance audit going into our sunset. We learned this week that the single state audit is not going to occur this year, so we do have 2 current ongoing audits, and we should hear something from those, the first one, by probably early October or no later than November the 1st. So, and as a way of another announcement off to the side, in case I forget, just remind y'all that first Saturday in August is coming up, duck blind drawings across the state. A lot of people will be involved in those. A lot of people attend those. Big social event for lots of folks, but just remind you that that's coming up, and it'll be taking place wherever we have everything that duck blind drawing, except those that have their own site drawings as they go throughout the year. So that being said, I'll just tell you that what I plan to do, and talking with Chairman Woodson, I'm going to spend more time, I think, on process than actually the budget itself, as we will go through that in detail at the Budget Committee meeting and also at the later in the August regular commission meeting. But I will go over where we think we are now, what the big ticket items are that you're probably going to see in the budget, those kind of things. But I thought the process itself would be worthy of noting, and I plan to spend as much time as you want to spend on this. This is really the biggest item we have on the agenda today, so I don't think we're going to cut into anybody else's time in going forward. But the budget actually is a process that does not stop. It goes throughout the year, but as you know, we bring things to you budget related several times during the year, and we'll talk more about those in a second. But essentially the big crunch for us starts in May, and that's when we begin the very first part of the budget presentation and preparation. So talk about this for just a second process wise. When I say a work unit, it could be like a small crew that works on a particular management area or hatchery. They may not be associated with either of those, but whoever their supervisor is, that work unit comes to that supervisor and says, this is where we are in terms of what we are doing now, what we need, and they put together their ideas to their supervisor, which then takes that on to the program manager, and there's one of those in each region. For each discipline, there's a program manager for enforcement, wildlife, and fisheries, and then, so everybody that's in that area, in the information education program, folks, they all put together what they think they need budget-wise, get that to their respective chiefs, and then the chiefs compile that on the side of the division. So each division then comes forward with what their particular need is. I'm used to looking left instead of right.
Ed, while you're changing, I would like to say it would be easier, commission members probably, if you guys have a question about something, if before we go to the next screen, it'd probably be that.
Okay.
But just, anyway, I'll recognize you and we'll ask them then. It'd be a lot easier than trying to go back at the end, so. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
When I say they bring their needs together to bring to their respective chiefs at the end, these are the things that they're looking at, those things that they ordered or purchased in the year that we just ended on June the 30th, but they either didn't receive or it hasn't been paid for. So we have to bring those things into account in going into this year's budget, which makes juggling the figures a little bit dicey right at the end because you're starting a new budget year and trying to bring the other things forward. Then there are things that happen during the year. A pump goes out on a management area, a vehicle goes down, a bulldozer breaks, something that nobody anticipated. And so we're going into a thing starting July the 1st. And they're going, this was not budgeted, but we need it now. We'll need to work that into this year's budget. And that's some of the things that come forward as well. And then there's the things that they're putting together, which is what this budget preparation is for 18-19. So we're looking a year away from now as to when this budget will start, trying to anticipate what we're going to need. And those are things we call improvements. That would be those things that everybody has an amount of money that is allocated when we get to the end of the budget process. And if there's something that they can't work into that money or take money away from something they have existing, they put together an improvement. And that improvement means next year for the 18-19 budget, we would come into the commission and say, this is what we anticipate we need for that year, and it will be above what we spent this year. And if it is, we call that an improvement, and then put that together in a separate package altogether. After all that's done, then the chief puts together their budget. They come into to what we call the director's staff review. And to tell you just a little bit about that review, when we get everything done, you'll receive a booklet like this that outlines our budget, and then it will have this, it'll have this whole series of numbers, and I'll give you one of these in a second, but they'll have this whole series of numbers of 25 different items, and every one of those 25 different items is a separate code within each budget, and we have 450 budgets. So we go through each one of those budgets and look at each one of those 450 years things on a 3-year comparison. We looked at what happened ending June the 30th and the 2 years prior to that, and we compare each line item of those 25 items of all 150 budgets. So when we get through with that, we know if people are coding things in the right place, if somebody's overspending, underspending, anticipated needs, all those kind of things over a 3-year time period. Then we put each of those improvement requests and carry forwards and all those things together. We look at equipment completely separate, and then people justify what equipment needs they have, and knowing that it's across the state, any one particular unit or any one particular region may have more allocated money than the year before. And we just move money around to where the needs are for that particular time. Those reviews last, some people have no budget really to look at. Ken Tarkington, for instance, and his folks, they have very little travel. They have very little in supplies, so it takes about an hour to go through Ken's budget and the revenue folks, but we get into some of the other disciplines, wildlife, fisheries, and so forth. It'll take us 9 to 10 hours to go through each one of those budgets with that group. After we get through with that review and we put together where we think we are on a budget, we're going to put that into that total agency document, which is what I was referencing here in the little book. We'll bring that to the budget committee and go through there. Then we'll bring it to the full commission. And that's the one that we ask you to act on in August. And the reason we ask in August is because we have a drop-dead date that we have to have our budget downtown to be included with the governor's preparation. So we ask you to do that in August because after you get through with whatever changes you make, we'll go in and readjust all the budgets that we have, and that each one has a ripple effect, obviously. And we'll go down through there till we get to the end of that, then put it together in a different format altogether that goes into the governor's budget document. And then we'll send that to the Commissioner of Finance Administration. Then the Commissioner of Finance Administration asks us to come and review our budget with them. So we go over, that's the same thing we've gone over with you, except in a different format with different questions. And then we'll take that final document, it goes into the governor's document. Then after that, we go to the legislature. We appear before the budget committees, 2 in the House and 1 in the Senate. And after all of that's done, the budget that we've started on in May and that you're looking at that we're starting to do forward finally gets to be a document that we have a budget for 18-19. So I'll stop and take a breath there. If anybody got any questions on that whole process, it's
Ed, has this process changed at all with the adjustments on the operations side of the agency? What are the differences between before a year ago and this year's budget in terms of process?
The difference used to be that the budgets were prepared as regional in Nashville. So we would have the same budget review, same process, and on, but rather than looking at a wildlife division budget or a fisheries division budget, we would look at 4 regional budgets and a Nashville office budget. So the difference now is that though we still have the regional components and all that comes up the same way, but in terms of looking at it holistically for the entire state as opposed to regions, we have a wildlife budget, fisheries budget, enforcement budget as opposed to each individual one. Obviously, the point of getting the budget together is to being able to allocate money where it needs to go. This is only a smattering of those places that we actually spend money, but I want to give you just a quick overview of, once we get all that together, of where these funds are spent. I'll start out with a little bit of wildlife management areas, and I'll tell you off the top, we're still about 2 to 3 weeks away from having everything finalized and closing and on and on. So some of these numbers would change, but this is give you a ballpark idea of where money gets spent. Of the 2 million acres that we manage, and some of those are obviously other people. We own 500,000 acres of land in Tennessee, but we manage another 1.5 million. And to do that, of course, it takes manpower and personnel. Then we have our particular wildlife management areas that we own, about 169 of those, with 65 of them being upland areas and 104 being waterfowl areas. And they each have their own challenges. Waterfowl areas typically have a lot of hands-on maintenance because of the pumping, the crops, and all those kind of things, and blinds, construction and blinds, all the things that go with waterfowl hunting. So it's a little bit more intensive. On in terms of breaking personnel out, we have about 105 that are on wildlife management areas. Each time we go into a budget, that's where a lot of the money gets spent, because as equipment goes down, for instance, in this budget we're preparing now, we had a number of tractors that were 30-plus years old that have just worn out, and we're replacing. Depending on the kind of equipment it is, it may vary anywhere from $25,000 to $120,000. Our total WMA budget is roughly $14 million, give or take a couple million on any one year, depending on how things fall out. I want to mention just a second on the off-highway vehicle budget, which is about $212,000. We're the only state agency that maintains an off-highway vehicle program. It was done as a project, and it's a part of the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area. We have dedicated people to that, but because of the way our funds come in, we can't use license dollars to do it. So that $212,000 is a flow-through budget that comes in from 2 different spots. Amount of money that comes from the Federal Department of Transportation to the State Department of Transportation, and then TDEC, and then over to us for trails management. And that's what this money is generated off of, plus the permits that people buy when they go to ride OHVs on the North Cumberland. So that's a totally separate program that you probably don't hear much about, but it's a very popular one for the people that live in that area. Our fisheries side, you can look there. There's 25 major reservoirs, lots of other smaller ones, 17,000 miles of stream. The operation of our state fish hatcheries are one of the things that's most popular and things that we do. You can kind of get an idea. We have 10 of those if you count the endangered species one, and you get an idea of how much pounds of fish are raised or fingerlings raised in each one of those. In terms of personnel, we have about 35 people on any one year. That's assigned to hatcheries in about a $3.2 million program. The rest of the fisheries projects, another $7 million, for a little over $10 million that generally go into the fisheries programs. The enforcement capability of the agency is a little different. Enforcement is the only thing that is mandated to not use any federal funding in. So everything that's in enforcement is all state license dollars, with the exception of boating, and then it has to be matched with state dollars from boat registrations and the money we get through the U.S. Coast Guard. So this is the number of people we have. Again, give or take a few people, but about 240 people that are commissioned, others that are directly in the enforcement program. The difference being those people that are in wildlife management areas that have specialty jobs, investigators or whatever, that aren't considered wildlife officers in a county or in a district, but they're commissioned personnel, which ups the number of people we have that are actually commissioned in our enforcement program. I mentioned to you that it's funded entirely out of license dollars. Every time we hire a new wildlife officer, the training and the equipment generally runs about $18,000 an officer, not counting vehicles, boats, that kind of thing. These are uniform items, training, all those things that get a person up to speed to begin as an agency officer. We operate about 182 patrol boats. That's not counting those that are on wildlife management areas or those that are using the fisheries programs. These are the ones that are directly in boating enforcement. It costs us anywhere from $380,000 to $480,000 a year to repair and replace boats, motors, and trailers, and we try to do that on a regular basis so that it's a little different if you're in a recreational boat and your boat goes down, you just can't go out. You just don't go out that day. But if you're the person that has to respond to an accident or an enforcement problem, you have to have something you can count on, you know, is durable and will uphold the mission that you're trying to do for that particular day. So we try to keep our fleet, so to speak, in pretty good shape.
Director?
Yes, sir.
I have a question, Mr. Karen. Remind me, what the replacement boats, what happens to our old boats? They're surplus, and who sells them? And
They are surplus. All of our surplus equipment goes through the Department of General Services downtown, and they maintain a site. They have physical locations, but they also have an online bidding process for people who want to bid on them. Local governments and everybody else gets a shot at it first, and sometimes they bid on them. We by state law, cannot give those to like a county or a city, so they would have to pay for those, but they get them at a much reduced price. Then whatever that sells for, minus, I think it's 10%, is that 15? The Department of General Services charges us 15% for the sale of that. We get back all except that. I don't. Oh, let me go back to where I was. I want to make just a couple of points here. In our enforcement budget, about 69% of it obviously comes through license dollars, and the other 31% is in boating. But one of the things I want to raise is we hear a lot of times, especially from people who aren't familiar with how the agency works or is funded, and they'll go, well, from all those citations y'all write, you must be getting rich. And which I wanted to point out that it's 1% of less than 1% of our entire agency budget. And one of the things that I want you to know for sure, most of our fines that are attached to a citation are about $10. That's the general going fine. Of that $10, the agency would get $4.50. So when a person gets a $300 ticket or a $250 ticket, the agency is going to get $4.50. The rest of it's going to go to the county that thing was written in. So it makes a big difference. There is an arrest fee that goes with that sometimes, and occasionally that's another $17.50. But anyway, at a $300, the most we're going to get is about $21.50.
Question. Is that also the case when somebody is fined for, let's say, shooting an 8-point buck out of season and the restitution? Do we get any part of that?
The restitution comes back to the agency, but the fine and the court costs and all that stays the same. The violation is handled separately than the restitution.
Do we get all the restitution, or do we just?
Yes, to my knowledge, we do.
100%.
Yes, sir.
Director, there was discussion some years ago about trying to ask the legislature to change these from criminal to civil penalties. Seems like that's what it was, and we could get most of the money rather than it going to the county. Is that's?
It's still an ongoing discussion. There's lots of component parts to that. There are certain violations we wouldn't want to decriminalize, but a lot of them stand the possibility of going that way. But again, it's not a very popular discussion with the counties for obvious reasons. I don't mean that funny. I mean, they look at what amount of money that they're getting off of court costs, in which they fund several things, everything from schools to retirement programs, on and on. So yes, sir, it's still an ongoing discussion, and some states have done that. Florida Florida has a similar situation.
Do you think that's something that we should step up the conversation about for next year, or maybe have a discussion about it?
I'm all up for having a discussion. Like I said, when I first started looking at it several years ago, I thought, well, that's pretty simple if we can just get folks to vote for it. And I found out, as everything else, there's lots of side issues that go with it, but it would be a very good discussion item to have at a commission meeting.
Or with some of the legislators, perhaps?
I would hope, yeah, I would like to get our thoughts together before we go to them, but I think that would be a great discussion to have prior to our legislative package that we have in any one year. One of the things that I think you all recognize, but some folks don't, and I want to point this out from a budget standpoint as much as anything else, we're a part, by Governor's executive order, of the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. We have two people who fill that role, as every state agency is supposed to have, but because of the kind of equipment we have, boats, four-wheelers, four-wheel drive, all those kind of things, we're generally one of the first groups that get called on any kind of natural disaster, and sometimes even like the fires in Gatlinburg and on. We'll get those kind of calls, and we'll do whether it's snows, floods, fires, tornadoes. We do have people who are specialized in missing persons and tracking, and we get involved in all those kind of things, which of course there's no money that comes back to our agency for those events unless it's a declared declared federal disaster, and then we can get back up to 75% of what we spend. But we've always gone forward with this, well, we can't not do it. We're in part of our good neighbor policy and all those kind of things. You can't sit in the county or anywhere else while the place has a really important disaster going on, whatever it happens to be. We've had people who spend hours and hours cutting trees out of the roads to get ambulances and things into areas while snowstorms are going on. We did the same thing during the fires. When there's any kind of a waterborne thing, we're the only state agency by law, the only state agency that has responsibility and jurisdiction for boating in the state of Tennessee. So when all those things that just happened on the 4th of July, every city that has a fireworks thing on the water, it's our agency that patrols those, and we get no money for that other than perhaps this year we can start looking with the legislative effort that's going to give back some of the money from the marine fuel tax that will help with that. But we've always shouldered that regardless before we had any. I want to mention the national security part because a lot of folks don't know that we really get involved in that much. But I'll go back to 9/11. I was our emergency services coordinator then. And when the first plane hit the Twin Towers, I got a call from TEMA. They said, stand by, something's going on in New York. Well, I was on my way to Crossville. So a few minutes later, they're going to grab everybody you can get, go to all the nuclear plants. We're afraid of what's going to happen in Tennessee. And that's been our role even now. Even when we have a nuclear disaster drill in Tennessee, our folks are the people that block the waterways around all the nuclear plants, and we still have that mission going forward. When the president comes to town, somebody has to be on the water underneath the bridges and all that kind of stuff. That falls to our people again. We work with the U.S. Coast Guard on vessels of interest. It's not unusual for us to track a vessel all the way from the Bahamas into downtown Nashville. We've done that on occasion. We even tracked one going to Iraq, working with Interpol, and found a boat full of missiles. So anyway, we weren't there, but we were part of the coordination that put that together to make that happen. All the locks and dams, the U.S. Corps Engineers and the TVA both have their own security, but when a disaster happens, it's our folks that get tasked to go to those areas to make sure that they're secured. So I just wanted to mention to you that's something a lot of people don't know that our budget has to accommodate, but it does, and there's no reimbursement for that. Except, like I said, for this year, maybe so.
Let me say something while you're on that subject, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman. To expand on that emergency just for a second, when Katrina hit in 2005, I guess it was, TWRA sent a dozen or so crews.
32, actually.
32
huh?
to New Orleans, and 2 or 3 of the guys were some guys that I was close to, and they took video and pictures of the things that they did, and they've done it since then when the Cumberland River flooded and some other things. But these guys, these agency guys do when they're called, they know what to do and how to do and do a fantastic job. They did some things in New Orleans that put their life on the line, and they did a great job. So while you're talking about emergencies, our guys do a super job.
And they usually get recognized inside the TEMA circle for that, but not much further. But yeah, they really do, and thank you, Commissioner Cox, for pointing that out. That's, moving on to the boating side of things, there on the facilities, our engineering crew, this is a rough estimate because we build access areas every year or revamp others, but we handle about 300 launching areas or access areas across the state, and we have about 19 people that are assigned to that. The annual budget's about $1.6 million. I'll just point out to you that none of that's licensed dollars. It's boat registration and federal funding that go together. So any of the boat launching areas and all those things, no matter how many fishermen use it or how many boaters use it, it's all paid out of boating funds. So that's been that way since about 1979. We also have two other programs, and these are all federally funded, but they're very important to a lot of folks. The grants for pump out stations are part of the Clean Vessel Act that keeps sewage from boats going into the water. We give out several $1 million a year over the last several years. We were listed as the #1 program in the United States about 5-6 years ago. A little longer than that now. And the same thing for the transient boating facilities. Again, that's what Chattanooga, Clarksville, Knoxville, a bunch of your big cities that do the boating facilities along their waterways and their downtown areas. We're involved in those quite a bit on the funding side and on the planning and engineering side. These are some that I'm saying for folks that haven't been involved in the agency for a while are a little surprised to know that we get bills for being part of the state government that we have to pay to the rest of state government. I want to just point those out. These are ones that we have paid in the past, so it's not necessarily what we'll be doing this year. And some of this we get back by writing a letter and saying it's a diversion of funds. We can't pay you all of these, but a lot of the things that we pay still are bills that we get every year, and we don't know what they're going to be from one year to the next, and we don't have any choice but to pay them. So it's putting together a budget. It's hard to do sometimes when you don't anticipate that any one particular part of state government has gone up in cost, but they bill us for it and we pay it. There's not any negotiation.
Question. It was reported, I guess, at the last meeting or the meeting before that we hadn't been billed for this year yet, and that when Ken asked about it, they were kind of vague. Do we know if we're going to have to pay it this year?
We don't, and they actually have until, they generally close the books around December, wouldn't you say? So we've got that to sweat until December. But so far, so good, yeah. We'll all keep our fingers crossed. That's anywhere from $400,000 to $800,000 a year that would save us if we're not billed for that. I want to mention that very last one, reduced licenses. Because of all the actions that have been taken over the years to give people from, regardless of what group of people it is, a reduced license cost, we've estimated that based on that same licensing figure, and Barry put some figures together just before he left, we think it costs us about $5 million a year in those reduced license costs. But this last legislative session, you remember, I think Chris reported on this before, they did pass a bill that says from this day forward, it's not retroactive, this day forward, anybody that comes forward to reduce license, the general fund has to make up the difference and give back to us what we would lose in that funding. So it's not going to help us retroactively, but it's certainly going to help us in two ways. Going forward, it's awfully hard to go down and argue against reduced licenses for any particular group of people who would all say, yeah, they really need that. But at the same time, that's the only way we exist, so it puts us in a bad situation. We won't have to do that anymore. I'm glad to report that that's the case. Getting more into the actual budget itself rather than programmatic things now, kind of switching gears here. We really work off of about 3 different funds. Our wildlife.
Hold on.
Yes, sir.
Before you go on, I didn't stop you. I need to have a question on the wildlife management areas.
Okay.
Just for my education. You said, how many acres do we own?
500,000.
That's what I thought. And then we manage 1.3 million?
Another $1.5 million.
So who grants us management? I mean, how do we get to manage those areas?
It's like the lands around the reservoirs. If it's TVA property or Corps of Engineers, we go into a working agreement with them and we have a long-term lease that the management of the wildlife on those areas. They cede over to us, but they still own it. Same, and in that figure is also the Cherokee Wildlife Management Area, which is also the Cherokee National Forest. But it's all of those things.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
The funds and balances, again, we have three major funds that we work out of, and you can see the percentages there. The Wildlife Fund counts for about 87% of our budget, the boating about another 13%. We do have a Wetlands Fund, which y'all have heard about and we do utilize, but it's something that's incorporated into the wildlife budget as money is available or as projects that qualify are pulled into that. So just wanted to mention how those work and talk just a little bit about how those funds in itself operate. And this is why our budget gets so doggone complicated when you start trying to, sometimes I know we all probably think that when you ask us a question and we kind of hem and haw around, it's because it's hard to come up with a straight answer sometimes because the budget is complicated in the way it's put together and its funding. For instance, in the wildlife side, there's state funds, and that's everything from marine fuel tax to wetlands funds, to other things that come in, but there's 7 different sources that make up the state funding on that, which are about 56% of our budget. The federal funding, again, while one way or another, it's pretty much all going to come through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. Coast Guard, but when you break those down, there are 6 sources on the wildlife side and 4 on the boating side that all enter into how that's funded, along with the state funds and the boating, which the state funds are boat registrations and what now will be marine fuel tax. On the wetlands fund, there's 2 different things we have to do in that. One is acquisition of property, and the other is maintenance. So we can fund things out of the wetlands fund for acquisition, and some qualifying projects that we can fund out of maintenance and what. Not everything is, but where we can, and we utilize those judiciously because there are a lot of folks who get very much involved in the wetland side of the world. So we talk about acquisition and maintenance separately. There's also a fund that we pay local governments out of that. And when we buy a piece of property in the wetlands fund so that it doesn't come off the tax rolls, we pay every year in lieu of taxes. So whatever the tax was on that piece of property that went to the county in the way of property tax, we pay that at one time a year.
Got a quick, Chairman Woodson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ed, and this is kind of going back to Commissioner King's question about the 500,000 acres that we own, but the full 2 million that we manage. Can you talk a little bit about management? Sometimes it means law enforcement. Sometimes it means habitat management, and there are costs and capacity issues related to both. Can you talk about the diversity of what it really means to manage that?
Well, you're exactly right, and it breaks down into all those categories. On the Cherokee National Forest, which is the largest management area in the state, we don't own it, but it's the largest one that's considered a wildlife management area. The agency funds $80,000 that we give every year to the Cherokee National Forest for habitat development, food plots, road maintenance, and those kind of things, so that our hunters can access that. We also do joint law enforcement. So our people patrol the Cherokee just the same way that U.S. Forest Service has personnel there as well. So it is both on the Cherokee. When you get into things like the Old Hickory Wildlife Management Area, it belongs to the Corps of Engineers, the property, but we're the folks that go in and actually manage that on their property. All they do is lease that to us. They don't do any active management as the Cherokee would do. So we'll go in there, we'll do the farming operations for the waterfowl area. We'll do the forestry operations and management of trees and those kind of things. Where we have agreements, most of the agreements when it comes to forestry on those other lands is a whole different story. But sometimes the habitat management is always ours when it comes to TVA, Corps of Engineers, and those kind of things. When we get into things like the Fort Campbell, Milan, those things that are associated with the U.S. Army, or in Millington, where we go in with the Navy or the Air Force or whoever is involved in a particular project, like at AEDC and so forth. We have specialty agreements, and they have their own wildlife people, and we work jointly in putting together a plan. But just like, I'll take AEDC again. AEDC is an Air Force property. They have their own personnel, but all they do is pretty much help us get together the management plans. Then we go in and actively farm it, cut it, do the enforcement, all those kind of things. So it's a combination of all those depending on the particular property, but it goes in some areas from nothing but law enforcement to very intensive management depending.